It wasn't until I caught Dane staring through the bedroom window that I realized I'd forgotten to close the curtains. And the worst part? I was wearing the most revealing lingerie I'd ever owned. The moment froze in time. I stood in front of the mirror, still holding the delicate strap of the sheer black chemise I'd been adjusting, my face burning as I registered his shocked expression. He was walking across the backyard, casually heading to the garage, when his gaze happened to glance upward. I don't know what caught his attention, the movement, the lighting, or just dumb luck, but his eyes locked on mine through the glass. For a split second, neither of us moved. His expression was a mix of surprise and something else, something I couldn't name but made my stomach twist in a way I hadn't felt in years. Then, as quickly as it happened, he turned and walked away, his stride a little faster than before. I yanked the curtains closed with trembling hands, my heart pounding. What have I done? I whispered to myself, staring at the now covered window as though it could erase what he'd seen. The lingerie was part of an impulsive purchase I'd made during one of Peter's long business trips. I hadn't even taken the tags off yet. It was a silly indulgence, one I'd justified as a way to feel a little more confident, a little more alive. But now it felt like a glaring mistake. I tried to laugh it off. He probably didn't even notice the details, I told myself. It was just a passing glance, nothing more. But the heat in my cheeks and the flutter in my chest said otherwise. Later that evening, I stayed busy in the kitchen, desperate to push the incident from my mind. Peter was out of town as usual, and Dane hadn't come home yet. The house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that lets your thoughts grow louder than they should. When Dane finally walked through the door, I stiffened. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to me before he gave a casual nod. "Hey, Isabel." "Hi," I replied, keeping my voice light, though my hands gripped the edge of the counter. He dropped his bag by the door and headed for the fridge. The air between us felt different, heavier, though neither of us acknowledged it. As he poured a glass of water, he glanced at me again, his expression unreadable. Finally, he broke the silence. "About earlier." I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. "What about earlier?" I asked, though I already knew. "I didn't mean to, see anything," he said quickly, his tone awkward but not apologetic. "I just happened to look up and—" My face flushed again, and I waved him off, forcing a laugh. "It's fine, let's just forget it happened." He nodded, but his eyes lingered a second too long before he turned and headed upstairs. As I stood there in the kitchen, my pulse still racing, I knew one thing for certain. Forgetting wasn't going to be as easy as I'd hoped. I spent the next morning trying to shake off the tension from the night before. It wasn't like Dane and I had spoken about anything inappropriate. It wasn't like anything had happened. Yet, there was an undeniable shift in the air between us. The thought plagued me as I went about my chores. I kept replaying the way his gaze had lingered just a fraction longer than it should have. How his words, though awkward, had carried a subtle charge I couldn't ignore. Dane had moved back in with us after finishing college 6 months ago. It was meant to be temporary, just until he found a stable job and got on his feet. I hadn't minded at first. He was polite, easygoing, and helped out around the house without complaint, which was more than I could say for his father. Peter was rarely home these days. Between his real estate deals and weekend golf trips, he spent more time away than with us. When he was home, his presence was more like a passing shadow. A few polite words exchanged over breakfast, a pat on my shoulder as he left for the day. I'd grown used to it, to the emotional distance that had become the norm in our marriage. But Dane's presence in the house was different. He brought life into the quiet spaces, a warmth that had been missing for years. I hadn't realized how much I appreciated it until now, when that warmth had started to feel like a spark. Around mid-morning, as I was folding laundry in the guest bedroom, Dane poked his head in. "Hey, need a hand?" he asked casually. I glanced up, startled, then shook my head. "No, I've got it. Thanks, though." He leaned against the doorframe, his tall frame filling the narrow space. "You sure?" "I don't mind." "I'm sure," I said, folding a towel and placing it neatly in the basket. He didn't leave. Instead, he watched me for a moment, a small, unreadable smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Isabel," he said after a pause, his tone lighter now. "About yesterday." Dane, I interrupted, keeping my voice firm but kind. There's no need to talk about it. It was just an accident. Let's move on. I know, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. But, can I just say something? I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the edge of the basket. All right, I said cautiously. His smile faded, replaced by a sincerity that made my heart skip. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I respect you, and I would never, cross a line. His words caught me off guard. Thank you, Dane, I appreciate that. But, he continued, his eyes meeting mine, if I'm being honest, it wasn't something I could just forget. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I felt my cheeks flush, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. Dane, I'm your stepmother, I said quietly. You understand why this can't? Of course I do, he said quickly, cutting me off. I'm just saying, you don't have to pretend it didn't happen. Not with me. There was something disarming about his honesty, the way he didn't shy away from the awkward truth. I nodded, turning back to the laundry. All right, thank you for saying that. He lingered for another moment before finally leaving, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Over the next few days, I found myself hyper-aware of Dane's presence. Every time he entered the room, my pulse quickened. Every casual conversation felt like it carried a double meaning, even when it didn't. I told myself I was imagining things, that the incident by the window hadn't changed anything. But deep down, I knew better. One evening, while I was preparing dinner, Dane came into the kitchen. He opened the fridge, grabbed a soda, and leaned against the counter, watching me as I chopped vegetables. What's for dinner? He asked, his tone light. Stir-fry, I replied, keeping my focus on the cutting board. Smells good, he said, taking a sip of his drink. You're a great cook, you know. Thank you, I said, glancing up briefly. There was a pause, then he said, You ever think about doing something just for yourself? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? I don't know, he said, shrugging. You spend all this time taking care of the house of my dad. Do you ever do something just because you want to? I frowned, setting down the knife. I don't really think about it like that. Maybe you should, he said, his tone softer now. Before I could respond, the sound of Peter's car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. Dane straightened, giving me a small smile before leaving the kitchen. Peter came in, greeted me with a distracted kiss on the cheek, and headed straight to his office. I watched him go, a familiar ache settling in my chest. Later that night, as I lay in bed, Dane's words replayed in my mind. Do you ever do something just because you want to? The truth was, I couldn't remember the last time I had. The following morning, I found myself in front of the same bedroom mirror, holding up the black camise I'd stuffed into the back of my drawer after the incident. For some reason, I couldn't bring myself to put it away again. Instead, I slipped it on, adjusting the straps as I studied my reflection. It had been years since I'd felt beautiful. Not just presentable, but truly, undeniably beautiful. And now, as I stood there, I saw a version of myself I'd almost forgotten, a woman who still had life in her, who wasn't defined by her role as a wife or a stepmother. A knock at the door startled me, and I quickly grabbed a robe, wrapping it around myself. Come in, I called, my voice steadier than I felt. Dane opened the door, his expression unreadable. Sorry to bother you, he said. I just wanted to see if you needed help with anything today. I shook my head. No, I'm fine, thank you. He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the edge of the robe where a hint of black lace peeked through. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. All right, he said finally, stepping back. Let me know if you change your mind. As he closed the door, I sat down on the edge of the bed, my heart racing. Something was shifting between us, and I didn't know how to stop it. The tension in the house was palpable, an invisible thread pulled taut between us. I tried to go about my days as usual, cleaning, cooking, managing the small details of running a household. But it was impossible to ignore the way Dane's presence seemed to fill every corner of the space. It wasn't just me. He was different, too. He lingered longer in the kitchen when I was making coffee. He started sitting on the edge of the couch when I watched my favorite old movies, feigning interest in films he clearly didn't care about. And when we talked, there was something unspoken in his tone, a challenge, a curiosity, an unguarded honesty that was as thrilling as it was terrifying. I told myself it was harmless. But even I didn't believe that anymore. The breaking point came on a warm evening in early summer. Peter was out of town again, this time for a 3-day conference in Chicago. Dane and I were alone in the house, the weight of it pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. The power went out just after dinner, plunging the house into darkness. "Great," I muttered, fumbling in a drawer for the flashlight. "This is just what I needed." "Hold on," Dane said behind me, the sound of his footsteps steady and calm. "I've got candles in my room." A few minutes later, the living room was illuminated by the soft glow of several candles. It felt strangely intimate, the flickering light dancing across the walls. I sat on the couch, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened when Dane sat beside me, closer than he needed to. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm fine," I replied, though my voice betrayed me with a slight tremor. He leaned back, stretching one arm across the back of the couch. "You don't seem fine." I glanced at him, trying to keep my expression neutral. "It's just a power outage, Dane. I'll survive." "That's not what I meant," he said, his gaze steady. "You've seemed different lately." I felt my throat tighten. "Different how?" He shrugged, his eyes never leaving mine. "I don't know, like you're carrying something you don't want to share." I looked away, focusing on the candlelight instead of the intensity in his expression. "Everyone has things they keep to themselves." "Not everyone," he said softly. There it was again. That honesty, that disarming way he had of cutting through my defenses. I felt the words bubbling up before I could stop them. "What do you want me to say, Dane? That I'm lonely? That your father and I haven't really been a couple in years? That I don't even know who I am anymore outside of this house?" The words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. I immediately regretted them, but Dane didn't flinch. "I want you to say whatever's real," he said, his voice steady. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You don't understand. You're too young to—" "To what?" he interrupted, his tone sharper now. "To know what it feels like to be stuck? To want something you can't have?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He leaned closer, the space between us shrinking until I could feel the warmth of him, the sheer presence of him. "Dane," I began, my voice trembling. "I'm not a kid," he said firmly, his eyes searching mine. "I'm not blind either. I see you, Isabel. I see the way you try to hold it all together, the way you pretend everything's fine when it's not." "You don't know what you're talking about," I said, standing abruptly and moving toward the window. "Don't I?" he asked, his voice following me. "Why won't you just admit it? Admit that you're tired of pretending." I turned to face him, my hands trembling at my sides. "Because it's wrong, Dane. Whatever this is, whatever you think this is, it's wrong." He stood then, crossing the room in a few long strides until he was standing in front of me. "It doesn't feel wrong," he said quietly. My breath hitched. The words were so simple, so earnest, and they hit me harder than any argument could have. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I said, "It doesn't matter how it feels." "It matters to me," he replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. The air between us was electric, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. And then, before I could second-guess it, his hand reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice low and steady. I should have. I knew I should have. But the words wouldn't come. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the windows felt harsh, unforgiving. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the night before in my mind. I'd crossed a line I could never uncross, and yet, the guilt I expected to feel didn't come. Instead, there was something else, a strange, quiet exhilaration, like a secret I couldn't help but savor. When I finally emerged from my room, Dane was in the kitchen, frying eggs. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said casually, as though nothing had changed. "Morning," I replied, my voice soft. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the sizzling pan and the chirping birds outside filled the silence. "Isabel," he said finally, his tone serious. I looked at him, my heart pounding. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I nodded. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. He smiled then, a small reassuring smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "We'll figure it out." I wanted to believe him. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Over the next few days, we fell into an unspoken rhythm. We didn't talk about what had happened, but it was there, lingering beneath the surface of every interaction. A shared secret, a silent understanding that neither of us could deny. But the house didn't feel like ours alone anymore. The ghost of Peter's presence hung heavy in the air, a reminder of everything we were risking. One afternoon, as I was watering the plants in the garden, Dane came up behind me. "Isabel," he said softly. I turned, startled, and nearly dropped the watering can. "What is it?" He hesitated, his hands in his pockets. "I don't want you to regret this." I stared at him, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "I don't," I said firmly. "But you're scared," he said. It wasn't a question. "Of course I'm scared," I admitted. Whatever this is, it's complicated. "We'll figure it out," he said again, stepping closer. "Together." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could navigate the impossible maze we'd created for ourselves. But as I looked at him, at the determination in his eyes, I couldn't help but wonder how long we could keep the rest of the world at bay. And how much longer I could keep pretending that this wasn't destined to fall apart. For the first time in years, I felt alive. It was reckless and irrational, but it was as if some long-dormant part of me had been awakened, refusing to be ignored. Every stolen glance, every casual touch that lingered just a second too long, sent my heart racing. Dane's presence filled the quiet spaces of the house, and it was impossible to ignore how much I had started to crave it. But the thrill of our connection came with a cost. Guilt loomed over me like a shadow, and no matter how much I tried to push it aside, it was always there, whispering in the back of my mind. It happened one lazy afternoon. I'd decided to clear out some of the clutter in the garage, a task I'd been putting off for months. The summer heat made the air thick and stifling, and sweat beaded on my forehead as I sorted through old boxes. Dane appeared in the doorway, a bottle of water in his hand. "Need some help?" he asked, his smile easy, as if this was just another ordinary day. "I won't say no," I replied, grateful for the company. He set the bottle down and started moving boxes to the side, his movements efficient and effortless. The silence between us was comfortable at first, but as the minutes ticked by, the air grew heavier, charged with something unspoken. At one point, I bent down to lift a box, and Dane's hand brushed mine as he reached for it at the same time. The contact was brief but electric, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Sorry," he murmured, but he didn't pull away immediately. I straightened, stepping back to put some distance between us. "It's fine," I said, though my voice trembled slightly. "Isabel," he began, his tone serious. I shook my head, cutting him off. "Dane, we can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "Pretending there's nothing between us?" I looked away, my heart pounding. "This isn't right, you know that." "Maybe it's not," he said, stepping closer, "but it doesn't change how I feel." I turned to face him, my resolve crumbling under the weight of his gaze. "Dane, it's dangerous." "For who?" he challenged, his voice steady. "Your husband who's never here? The neighbors who don't even look twice at us?" "For us," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm. "I'm not afraid of this, Isabel, are you?" The next few weeks were a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered confessions. Dane and I danced on the edge of a knife, our connection growing deeper with every passing day. But the closer we became, the more dangerous it felt. Peter began calling more often, his voice laced with suspicion. "Everything all right at home?" he asked one evening as I stood by the window, phone pressed to my ear. "Of course," I replied, forcing a lightness into my tone. "Why wouldn't it be?" "You just seem distracted lately," he said, his words sending a chill down my spine. "Is Dane giving you any trouble?" "No," I said quickly. "He's been a big help, actually." Peter paused, and for a moment, I was sure he was going to say something else. But then he simply muttered, "Good," and ended the call. It was around this time that Georgia, my oldest friend, announced she'd be visiting for a few days. "It's been too long," she said on the phone, her voice warm and familiar. "I miss you, Izzy." I couldn't say no, though the timing couldn't have been worse. When Georgia arrived, she brought her usual energy and sharp intuition. She was the kind of person who could read a room in an instant, and it didn't take long for her to pick up on the tension between Dane and me. One evening, as we sat on the back porch sipping wine, Georgia turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "All right, spill." she said, her tone playful but insistent. I laughed nervously. Spill what? Something's going on, she said, gesturing toward the house. You've been jumpy ever since I got here, and every time Dane walks into the room, you tense up like a spring. You're imagining things, I said, taking a sip of wine to avoid her gaze. Am I? She asked, her voice softer now. Izzy, you know you can tell me anything, right? Her words made my stomach churn. Georgia had been my confidant for years, but this was something I couldn't share. I'm fine, I said finally, forcing a smile. Really? She didn't look convinced, but she let the subject drop, for now. The night before Georgia was set to leave, she went to bed early, exhausted from the long day. Dane and I were alone in the living room, the silence between us heavy with everything we couldn't say. Are you okay? He asked, his voice low. I don't know, I admitted, my hands trembling slightly as I held the book I wasn't really reading. He moved closer, sitting on the edge of the coffee table in front of me. You don't have to keep doing this, he said softly. Pretending everything's fine. I don't have a choice, I said, my voice breaking. You always have a choice, he replied, his eyes searching mine. The weight of his words hit me like a tidal wave, and before I could stop myself, I reached out, my fingers brushing against his. In that moment, the rest of the world fell away. It was bound to happen eventually. No matter how careful we were, no matter how much we tried to hide, the truth had a way of creeping to the surface. It started with Georgia. She didn't say anything directly, but I caught her watching us more closely, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Then there was Peter. When he returned from his trip, his demeanor was different. Colder, more calculating. I could feel the weight of his suspicion in every glance, every clipped word. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, he walked in, his footsteps deliberate. Isabel, he said, his voice calm but firm. Yes, I asked, turning to face him. I've been thinking, he began, his eyes narrowing. Maybe it's time Dane found a place of his own. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Why would you say that? I asked, my voice trembling. He shrugged. He's a grown man. It's not healthy for him to stay here forever. I nodded slowly, my mind racing. I'll talk to him, I said, though the thought filled me with dread. Peter's gaze lingered on me for a moment before he left the room, and I knew. He was onto us. That night, Dane and I sat on the back porch, the darkness wrapping around us like a cocoon. He wants me to leave, Dane said, his voice tight with frustration. I know, I replied, my heart aching. What are we going to do? He asked, his eyes searching mine. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The days that followed were a blur of whispered conversations and stolen moments, each one tinged with the fear of discovery. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and no matter how much I tried to pretend otherwise, I wasn't ready to let go. It was a Thursday afternoon when the dam finally broke. I hadn't seen it coming, though in hindsight, maybe I should have. Secrets have a way of seeping into the cracks of a household, no matter how carefully you try to keep them contained. Peter came home early, hours earlier than I expected, and for once, he didn't call to let me know. I was in the living room, sorting through old photo albums, trying to distract myself from the growing tension in the house. The sound of the front door opening startled me. Peter? I called out, rising to my feet. He walked in, his face unreadable as he set his briefcase down by the door. Isabel, he said, his tone unnervingly calm. You're home early, I said, forcing a smile. I needed to talk to you, he replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. Where's Dane? The question caught me off guard. He's out, I said, though my voice wavered. Peter nodded, his gaze sharp as he stepped closer. Good, that makes this easier. Easier? I repeated, my stomach twisting with unease. He sat down on the edge of the couch, his movements deliberate. Isabel, I've been noticing things lately. Things that don't add up. My hands clenched at my sides. What are you talking about? The way you look at him, he said bluntly, his tone cold. The way he looks at you. Do you think I haven't noticed? My breath caught in my throat. Peter, you're imagining things, I said quickly. There's nothing. Don't lie to me, he interrupted, his voice rising. I'm not an idiot, Isabel. I've been watching. I've heard the whispers, the way you two go quiet when I walk into a room. I felt the blood drain from my face. It's not what you think, I said, though the words sounded hollow even to me. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Not what I think? Do you even realize what you're risking? My son, Isabel, my own son. Peter, please, I began, but he cut me off again. Do you love him? He demanded, his voice sharp and biting. The question hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. Answer me, he said, his tone colder now. I don't know, I whispered, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. Peter's expression hardened, and for a moment I thought he might lash out. But instead he leaned back, exhaling sharply. I should have seen this coming, he said bitterly. I should have known you'd betray me. I didn't mean for this to happen, I said, my voice trembling. That doesn't make it any better, he replied, his tone dripping with contempt. Later that evening, after Peter locked himself in his office, Dane came home. I met him in the hallway, pulling him into the kitchen before he could go upstairs. What's going on? He asked, his brow furrowing as he looked at me. Peter knows, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Dane's eyes widened. What did he say? He confronted me, I replied, my hands trembling. He knows something's been going on between us. Dane cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. What are we gonna do? I don't know, I admitted. He didn't say what he's going to do, but he's furious. I've never seen him like this. Dane's jaw tightened, his expression hardening. I won't let him hurt you, he said firmly. It's not me I'm worried about, I said, my voice breaking. He's going to want you out of this house. Then maybe it's time I leave, Dane said, though his tone was reluctant. No, I said quickly, shaking my head. That's exactly what he wants. If you leave now, it'll only make things worse. Isabel, he began, but I cut him off. We need to stay calm, I said, my voice steadier now. If we act like we've done something wrong, he'll use it against us. The next morning, Peter emerged from his office looking grim but composed. Over breakfast, he addressed me and Dane with an air of forced civility. I've been thinking, he began, his tone clipped. It's time we made some changes around here. What kind of changes? I asked, though I already knew. Dane needs to move out, Peter said bluntly. It's time he stood on his own 2 feet. Dane's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice calm. I've been helping out around the house. Why now? Because it's what's best for everyone, Peter replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. I opened my mouth to protest, but Peter silenced me with a look. Don't argue with me, Isabel, he said, his voice low. This is non-negotiable. That evening, Peter pulled me aside while Dane was upstairs. I could destroy you, you know, he said coldly. I stared at him, my heart pounding. What are you talking about? If word of this gets out, he continued, his tone calm but dangerous, it won't just ruin this family. It'll ruin you, your reputation, your friendships, everything. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. Why are you doing this? Because I've worked too hard to let you and Dane tear it all apart, he said, his eyes narrowing. You don't even love me, I said, my voice trembling. You haven't for years. Peter laughed bitterly. Maybe not, but that doesn't mean I'm going to let you humiliate me. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You have 2 choices, Isabel. End whatever this is with Dane and keep your place in this family, or lose everything. The next day, Georgia called me. Her voice was hesitant, almost guilty. I need to tell you something, she said quietly. What is it? I asked, my stomach twisting. It's about Peter, she began. He's been asking me questions about you and Dane, about whether I've noticed anything unusual. My blood ran cold. Why would he do that? Because he's suspicious, Georgia said. And because I told him things. I froze, the betrayal cutting through me like a knife. You what? I didn't mean to, Izzy, she said quickly. He caught me off guard, and I didn't know what to say. You sold me out, I said, my voice trembling with anger. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said, her voice breaking. But Peter offered to help me with my debt, and I didn't know what else to do. Her confession left me reeling. Not only was Peter trying to control me, but now Georgia had become part of his plan. As I hung up the phone, a wave of determination washed over me. Peter thought he had the upper hand, but I wasn't going to let him destroy me or Dane without a fight. The house was silent that evening, but the tension was suffocating. Peter's ultimatum and George's betrayal had left me spinning, and for the first time, I wasn't sure how to move forward. Dane stayed in his room, quiet and withdrawn. But I knew he was waiting for me to decide what came next. By the time Peter returned home from his office, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the living room. I stood by the window, my arms crossed, trying to steady my breath. He walked in and paused, his gaze sharp as he looked at me. "You've been thinking," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have," I replied, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "And?" I turned to face him, meeting his cold, calculating stare. "You think you've won," I said quietly. "You think you can control me, control us, by threatening to destroy everything. But you're wrong." His brow arched, but he said nothing, waiting for me to continue. "You want to talk about humiliation?" I said, stepping closer. "How do you think the world would react if they found out about your little secret? About the other woman in the city?" For the first time, Peter's composure slipped, his expression darkening. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Oh, but I do," I replied, my tone sharper now. "You've been unfaithful for years, haven't you? And you think I didn't notice? You think I didn't put the pieces together every time you extended your trips, or came home smelling like someone else's perfume?" Peter's jaw tightened, and I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. "So go ahead," I continued, my voice rising. "Threaten me. Blackmail me. But know this, if you try to ruin me, I'll make sure you lose everything too." The silence between us was electric, the weight of my words settling over the room like a storm. Finally, Peter exhaled sharply, his hands clenched at his sides. "You're playing a dangerous game, Isabel," he said. "I learned from the best," I shot back. Before he could respond, Dane appeared in the doorway, his expression calm, but his eyes blazing with determination. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice steady. Peter turned to him, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "Well, here's the golden boy now," he said. "You've certainly made a mess of things, haven't you?" Dane didn't flinch. "If there's a mess, it's because of you," he replied, his tone even. "You've neglected her for years, treated her like she's invisible. You don't get to play the victim now." Peter's face darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But instead, he simply shook his head, laughing bitterly. "You two deserve each other," he said finally, his voice dripping with contempt. As he walked out of the room, the weight in my chest lifted slightly. For the first time in years, I felt like I had reclaimed a piece of myself. But the fight wasn't over yet. When I stepped out of Eric's car that night, I didn't notice my husband standing on the porch right away. The cool night air hit me first, sobering me just enough to remind me that I'd had one too many glasses of wine at the company party. Eric, ever the gentleman, had insisted on driving me home after I fumbled with my phone, unable to order a ride. I thanked him as I closed the door, swaying slightly on my heels, and turned toward the house. That's when I saw Chris. He was standing in the dim porch light, arms crossed, his face shadowed but his expression unmistakable. Anger, betrayal, suspicion, all etched into the hard line of his jaw. My stomach dropped. "It's not what it looks like," I blurted out, though I knew how hollow the words sounded. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching me like he was waiting for me to dig my own grave. I stumbled up the steps, my heart pounding. "I drank too much," I tried to explain. "Eric was just being nice. He gave me a ride home." "Nice," Chris repeated, his voice cold. "That's what you call it?" I froze, unsure of how to respond. The weight of his accusation hung in the air between us, unspoken but deafening. I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, the foundation of everything we'd built together starting to crack. That moment was the beginning of the end. I didn't know it then, but it was the spark that would ignite everything. My marriage, my career, my reputation. All of it would burn because of one ride home, one mistake, and everything that came after. Looking back now, I can see all the cracks that had been there long before that night. My marriage to Chris wasn't falling apart because of one misunderstanding or even one bad decision. It had been unraveling for years, slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was just the usual things: work stress, missed date nights, arguments about the small stuff. But over time, those little things built into a wall, and neither of us had the energy or desire to break it down. Chris and I met in our mid-20s. He was charming and ambitious, with a knack for making me laugh, even when I was having the worst day. He worked in construction management, a field that suited his hands-on nature and straightforward personality. I was in marketing, just starting out at a small agency where I'd been working long hours trying to climb the ladder. We clicked instantly, and for a while it felt like we were unstoppable. We had the kind of passion that made other people envious. He was my rock, and I was his biggest cheerleader. But life has a way of grinding down even the strongest relationships. As Chris's career took off, so did mine. We bought a house in the suburbs, settled into routines, and somewhere along the way that spark we had started to dim. He began working longer hours, coming home late and exhausted. I threw myself into my work as a way to fill the void, climbing the corporate ladder until I landed a comfortable position as a marketing manager at a tech company. On paper, we had everything: a nice house, good jobs, a stable life. But beneath the surface, there was distance, silence, and the unspoken knowledge that neither of us was truly happy. It didn't help that my job placed me in the orbit of people like Eric. He was my boss, a charismatic, sharp-dressed man in his 50s who had an uncanny ability to command attention. Eric was the kind of person who could walk into a room and have everyone hanging on his every word within minutes. He was confident, charming, and just flirtatious enough to make you feel special without crossing any lines, at least not publicly. From the moment I started working under him, I could tell he had a soft spot for me. He praised my ideas in meetings, gave me high-profile projects, and always made a point to check in on me, even when it wasn't necessary. At first, I saw it as mentorship. I told myself he saw potential in me, that he wanted to help me succeed. And maybe that was true in the beginning. But as the months went on, his attention started to feel more personal. He complimented my outfits, lingered a little too long during conversations, and found excuses to call me into his office for quick chats that had nothing to do with work. I tried to brush it off, laughing awkwardly at his comments or steering the conversation back to business. I told myself it was harmless. Chris, on the other hand, wasn't so quick to dismiss it. He met Eric once, briefly, at a company event last year, and afterward, he made a comment that stuck with me. "That guy's too smooth for his own good," he said. I laughed it off, but I could tell Chris didn't like him. Over the months, he'd occasionally ask questions about Eric. Innocuous ones, like whether I was still working on that big project with him, or if he was attending the next company meeting. But there was always an edge to his tone, a subtle hint of suspicion that I tried to ignore. The night of the company party, I wasn't thinking about any of that. It was one of the biggest events of the year, held at a swanky downtown hotel with an open bar, a live band, and enough food to feed a small army. I spent the day obsessing over what to wear, finally settling on a black cocktail dress that was a little more daring than my usual style. Chris wasn't thrilled about me going without him, but he never enjoyed work events, so I didn't push it. The party was everything I expected: loud, glamorous, and just the right amount of over-the-top. I spent the first hour chatting with coworkers and sipping champagne, trying to navigate the fine line between enjoying myself and maintaining a professional image. Eric found me not long after I arrived, complimenting my dress in a way that made me blush despite myself. "You always know how to make an impression," he said, his eyes lingering just a second too long. As the night went on, I found myself drawn into Eric's orbit. He had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the room, his attention laser-focused and flattering. He poured me another drink, then another, and before I knew it, I was leaning against the bar, laughing at one of his stories. I told myself it was innocent, that I was just enjoying the party, but there was a small voice in the back of my mind warning me to be careful. By the time I realized how much I'd had to drink, it was too late. My head was spinning, and I could barely stand without wobbling. I reached for my phone to order a ride, but my fingers felt clumsy, and I struggled to navigate the app. Eric noticed immediately. "Let me drive you home," he offered, his voice calm and reassuring. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to say no, but the thought of trying to find another way home in my state felt overwhelming. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Of course," he said, placing a steady hand on my arm. "I'll make sure you get home safe." I told myself it was fine, that it was just a ride, but the moment I stepped into his car, I felt a pang of guilt. The drive was uneventful, mostly quiet aside from Eric asking if I was feeling okay. When we pulled up to my house, I thanked him and reached for the door handle, eager to put the whole night behind me. And that's when I saw Chris standing on the porch. Chris didn't move from his spot on the porch as I walked toward him, my heels clicking softly against the pavement in the stillness of the night. My pulse was racing, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, not from alcohol this time, but from the way his eyes bore into me. He didn't say a word until I reached the steps, where I hesitated, unsure of how to start. "Do you want to explain why your boss is dropping you off at this hour?" he asked, his voice calm, but with an edge sharp enough to cut. I opened my mouth, fumbling for the right words. "I had too much to drink at the party," I said quickly. "I couldn't drive, and I couldn't figure out the rideshare app. Eric offered to give me a ride, that's all." His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "That's all?" "Yes," I insisted, taking a step closer. "Chris, you know me. Nothing happened. He was just being nice." "Nice?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Since when does your boss care enough to chauffeur you home? Or is this just the first time I'm seeing it?" I felt a knot form in my stomach. "You're being ridiculous. It's not like that. I can't control how he acts, but I didn't do anything wrong." Chris let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Sure. And I'm just supposed to believe that, am I? You think I haven't noticed the way he looks at you? Or how much time you spend together at work?" I froze, the air between us crackling with tension. "He's my boss, Chris. We work together. Of course, we spend time on projects. That's my job. And the flirting? The compliments? Is that part of the job too?" His words hit like a slap, and I flinched despite myself. "There's nothing going on," I said, my voice trembling. "You're twisting this into something it's not." "Am I?" he shot back, his tone cold. "Because it sure as hell doesn't look like that from where I'm standing." I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, a mix of frustration and exhaustion washing over me. "I can't do this right now," I said, brushing past him and heading toward the door. Chris didn't stop me, but when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him standing there, his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Inside, I leaned against the door, closing my eyes and taking a deep breath. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, that Chris would calm down once we both had some space. But even as I thought it, I could feel the cracks widening between us, the foundation of our marriage trembling under the weight of his accusations. The rest of the night was a blur. I went upstairs, changed into pajamas and climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind was a storm of emotions. Anger at Chris for not trusting me, guilt for accepting Eric's ride, and a deep, sinking fear that this argument was only the beginning. When I finally drifted off, it was to the sound of the guest room door closing downstairs. The next morning, the tension was palpable. Chris was already awake when I came downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up when I entered. "Morning," I said tentatively, hoping to break the ice. "Morning," he replied curtly, his eyes never leaving the screen. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the silence between us stretching uncomfortably. I wanted to say something, to apologize or explain further, but I didn't know how to start. Chris wasn't the type to let things go easily, and I could feel the weight of his suspicion hanging over us like a dark cloud. The uneasy truce lasted until later that evening, when I came out of the shower to find Chris standing in the bedroom, holding my phone. My heart sank as I saw the look on his face, cold, accusing, and furious. "What are you doing with my phone?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Funny thing," he said, holding it up. "You left it on the counter unlocked, so I decided to take a look. Guess what I found?" My stomach twisted into knots. "Chris, give me my phone." He ignored me, his eyes narrowing as he scrolled through the screen. "Let's see. Here's a text from Eric, looking stunning tonight. And this one, let me know when you get home safe." He looked up, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just your boss being nice, right?" "Chris, stop," I said, stepping closer and reaching for the phone. But he pulled it back, his grip tightening. "Did you ever think to tell him to stop?" he demanded. "Or were you enjoying the attention too much?" "I didn't encourage him," I said, my voice trembling. "I was going to talk to him about it, but..." "But what?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "You were too busy letting him drive you home? letting him flirt with you? What the hell, Lena? I felt tears streaming down my face, frustration and guilt bubbling to the surface. I didn't do anything wrong, I said, though the words felt hollow even to me. Chris let out a bitter laugh, tossing the phone onto the bed. Sure. Keep telling yourself that. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him, and I sank onto the edge of the bed, my hands shaking. I picked up my phone, staring at the messages he'd found. They weren't explicit, but they weren't innocent either. Eric's compliments, his playful tone, it was all there, laid out in black and white. I wanted to scream, to cry, to undo everything that had led to this moment. But it was too late. The damage was done. Chris barely spoke to me over the next few days. He wasn't outright hostile, but there was a coldness in his demeanor that I couldn't ignore. He went through the motions, going to work, coming home, sitting on the couch with his laptop, but it was clear he was keeping me at arm's length. I tried to talk to him once, late one night after we'd both gone to bed. I turned to him in the dark, reaching for his hand. Chris, I love you, I said quietly. Please, can we just talk about this? He pulled his hand away, his voice flat. I'm tired, Lena. We'll talk later. But later never came. The days after the fight with Chris blurred into a strange routine of silence and avoidance. He wasn't outright cruel, but the way he moved through the house, cold and distant, made it clear he didn't trust me. I tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, hoping the tension would fade with time, but it didn't. The weight of his suspicion sat heavy on my shoulders, following me even when I left the house. At work, things weren't much better. I found myself hyper-aware of Eric's every word and gesture, as if Chris's accusations had made me see him through a different lens. I started to notice how often he stopped by my desk, how his compliments always seemed just a little too personal. I told myself it was nothing, that it had always been like this, and I was only overthinking because of what Chris said. But the truth was harder to ignore when Eric leaned against the edge of my desk one afternoon, his eyes lingering on me a moment too long. You look tired, he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I forced a smile, glancing back at my computer screen. Just a lot on my mind. Anything I can help with? He asked, his tone almost playful. I shook my head, not trusting myself to say more. The conversation was innocent on the surface, but the way he looked at me made my stomach flutter with a mix of unease and something I didn't want to admit. Later that week, Eric called me into his office to review a campaign we'd been working on. The meeting started off normal enough, graphs, projections, the usual back and forth about strategy. But as the conversation shifted, so did his tone. You've been distracted lately, he said, leaning back in his chair. I looked down at the folder in my lap, avoiding his gaze. Just some personal stuff, I said vaguely. Anything you want to talk about? He asked, his voice softening. The question caught me off guard, and before I could stop myself, the words spilled out. Chris thinks I'm having an affair. Eric raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. With who? I hesitated, my face flushing. With you. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and I immediately regretted bringing it up. But then he let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. That's ridiculous, he said. We're coworkers, friends even. Nothing more. His reassurance should have made me feel better, but the way he said it, the casual way he dismissed the idea, left me feeling oddly deflated. I'm sorry, I said quickly, standing up. I shouldn't have said anything. Hey, he said, his tone softening again. It's fine, really. If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know. I nodded, mumbling a quick thanks before leaving his office. But as I walked back to my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the tension between Chris and me only grew worse. He still barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was short and clipped, like he was holding back something he wanted to say. One evening, I stayed late at work to finish up a project. Most of the office had cleared out by then, leaving the building quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. I was so focused on my screen that I didn't notice Eric standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat. Burning the midnight oil? He asked, stepping into the room. Something like that, I said, leaning back in my chair and rubbing my temples. He walked over to my desk, glancing at the spreadsheet on my screen. You work too hard, Lena, he said, his voice low and familiar. You deserve a break. I let out a small laugh, more out of nervousness than anything else. Tell that to my deadlines. Eric didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned against the edge of my desk, his gaze steady. You know, I've been thinking, he said, his tone shifting. You're one of the most talented people I've worked with, and yet, I feel like you don't hear that enough. Eric, I started, but he cut me off. No, really, he said, his hand brushing against mine as he gestured. You deserve more than what you're getting, at work, at home, everywhere. The way he said it made my heart race. I looked up at him, my breath catching as I realized how close he was. Eric, I don't think. Before I could finish, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was both gentle and urgent. For a moment I froze, caught between shock and the undeniable pull of the moment. But then, against my better judgment, I kissed him back. The kiss deepened, his hands finding my waist as he pulled me closer. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to pull away, but my body wouldn't listen. There was something intoxicating about the way he held me, the way he made me feel seen and wanted in a way I hadn't felt in years. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a tidal wave. I stepped back, my breathing unsteady. This can't happen, I said, my voice trembling. Eric didn't respond right away. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, he said finally, though his tone didn't sound apologetic. I shook my head, grabbing my bag and practically running out of the office. My heart was pounding as I got into my car, my mind racing with guilt and confusion. I told myself it was just a moment of weakness, a mistake that wouldn't happen again. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I avoided Eric as much as possible, throwing myself into work and pretending nothing had changed. But it had. Every time I saw him, I felt a pang of guilt, mixed with an undeniable spark of something I didn't want to name. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. Chris's silence wasn't the passive kind. It wasn't the type of silence where things slowly blew over. It was loud, sharp, and deliberate, as if every unsaid word was a weapon he was carefully choosing before striking. I could feel it every time I walked into a room, every time we exchanged a forced good morning or good night. It was only a matter of time before something gave way, but I had no idea just how calculated he was being. At work, things with Eric had become complicated. After that kiss, I avoided him as much as I could. I wasn't sure what I expected, that he'd pretend it never happened, or that we could go back to our professional dynamic. But Eric wasn't the type to let things slide. When he walked into a room, his eyes would find mine, and I'd feel the weight of everything unspoken between us. He wasn't pushy, but his presence alone was enough to keep me on edge. It wasn't long before he cornered me in his office after a late meeting. Everyone else had gone home, leaving the building dark and quiet. I was packing up my things when he called my name. His tone was soft, almost apologetic, but there was an edge of something else. Determination, maybe. Can we talk? He asked, closing the door behind him. There's nothing to talk about, I said quickly, not meeting his eyes. Lena, he said, stepping closer. I'm sorry if I overstepped, but I can't stop thinking about you. My stomach twisted at his words, a mix of guilt and something I couldn't quite name. This isn't right, Eric, I said, my voice trembling. I'm married. His lips curved into a faint, almost knowing smile. Are you, though? The question hung in the air, sharp and piercing. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words caught in my throat. Because deep down, I knew what he meant. Chris and I hadn't been a real couple in years. We were roommates at best, strangers at worst. Eric stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. You deserve to be happy, Lena. You deserve someone who sees you. His words broke something in me. Before I could stop myself, I was kissing him, the weight of my guilt temporarily drowned out by the sheer intensity of the moment. This time, I didn't pull away. What started as stolen moments in his office quickly escalated. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though that was undeniably part of it. It was the way Eric made me feel, like I was the center of his world. He listened when I talked, paid attention to the smallest details, and made me feel like I mattered in a way Chris hadn't in years. I told myself it was just a fling, a temporary escape from the mess my life had become. But the more time I spent with Eric, the harder it became to draw the line between what was real and what was just a fantasy. Meanwhile, Chris was watching. I didn't know it at the time, but every move I made was being carefully observed, every late night at the office catalogued and scrutinized. He never confronted me again about Eric, but his questions became more pointed. "How's work?" he'd ask, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "You've been spending a lot of time there lately?" I brushed it off, telling myself he was just being paranoid. But the truth was, I underestimated him. Chris wasn't the type to make accusations without proof, and he was determined to get it. One night, after another late meeting with Eric, I came home to find Chris sitting on the couch, his laptop open on his lap. He looked up when I walked in, his expression unreadable. "You're late," he said, his voice flat. "I told you I had a meeting," I replied, kicking off my heels and setting my bag down by the door. "Must have been some meeting," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine, but I shrugged it off and headed upstairs. It wasn't until later that I realized my phone was missing. Panic set in as I searched the bedroom, my purse, the kitchen, anywhere I could think of. Finally, I went back downstairs, where Chris was still sitting on the couch. My stomach dropped when I saw my phone sitting on the coffee table in front of him. "Looking for this?" he asked, picking it up and holding it out. I reached for it, but he pulled it back, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "Interesting messages you've got here," he said, his tone casual but laced with venom. My heart stopped. "Chris, give me my phone." "Sure," he said, tossing it onto the couch beside him. "But you might want to explain why your boss is booking hotel rooms under his name and texting you things like, 'Can't wait to see you again.'" I froze, my mind racing as I tried to come up with an explanation. "You went through my phone?" "You left it on the counter," he said with a shrug. "What was I supposed to do? Ignore the notifications from Eric at 11 p.m.? "Chris, it's not what you think," I said, my voice trembling. "Don't insult me," he snapped, his voice rising. "You've been lying to me for weeks, hell, maybe months. And for what? Him?" Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I tried to find the right words, but nothing I said would have mattered. The damage was done. The next few days were a nightmare. Chris stopped pretending to be civil, instead throwing barbed comments my way whenever we were in the same room. I could feel the anger radiating off him, but he didn't confront me again, at least not directly. It wasn't until I started noticing the whispers at work that I realized what he'd done. It started small, sideways glances, hushed conversations that stopped when I walked by. But then Angela from HR called me into her office, her expression grim. "We received some concerning emails," she said, sliding a printed copy of a screenshot across the desk. My blood ran cold as I recognized the text between Eric and me, messages I thought were private now laid out in black and white. Chris had sent them to HR. And not just HR, he'd sent them to my coworkers, my friends, anyone who would listen. The fallout was swift and brutal. Eric was called into a disciplinary meeting, and though he tried to shield me from the worst of it, there was only so much he could do. By the end of the week, I was out of a job, my reputation in ruins. At home, things were even worse. Chris made no effort to hide his satisfaction as he watched me pack my things. "You brought this on yourself," he said, his voice cold. I hope he was worth it. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The first night after I left the house, I stayed in a motel on the edge of town, the kind with threadbare carpets and flickering neon signs. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, my suitcase half unpacked on the floor. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the old building settling into itself. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unravel from a distance. I tried calling Eric, but he didn't pick up. It didn't surprise me. His life was in just as much chaos as mine. The scandal Chris unleashed had reached every corner of our professional lives, and while I had been fired, Eric wasn't far behind. His name was splashed across office gossip, his reputation dragged through the mud, and rumors about his personal life ran rampant. For all his confidence and charm, he was just as exposed as I was, and part of me hated myself for dragging him into this. Another part wondered if he ever really cared about me at all, or if I was just another mistake he wished he could undo. Over the next few days, I tried to piece together the wreckage of my life. I stayed with a friend for a while, someone I hadn't seen much in recent years, but who welcomed me with open arms when I called, sobbing, asking for a place to stay. She didn't pry or ask for details, just handed me a cup of tea and told me I could stay as long as I needed. It was a kindness I didn't feel I deserved, but I clung to it like a lifeline. Eric finally called me back a week later. His voice was tired, more strained than I'd ever heard it. "Lena," he said, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, tears welling up again. "I know," he said, his tone softer. "It's not your fault." But it was, at least partly. We both knew that. He suggested we meet for coffee, and though I hesitated, I agreed. Seeing him again felt strange, almost surreal. He looked the same, well-dressed, composed, but there was a heaviness to him now, a crack in the confident facade he'd always worn so well. We talked for hours, picking apart everything that had happened, trying to make sense of it all. He told me his wife had found out about us through the same emails Chris had sent, and that she'd left him, taking their kids with her. I wanted to feel sympathy, but instead, I just felt empty. I realized then that whatever we'd had, or thought we'd had, was over. There was no saving it, no rebuilding from the ashes. Too much damage had been done, and neither of us had the strength to fight for something that had never really been built to last. When we said goodbye that day, it felt final. Eric hugged me, a gesture that felt more like closure than anything else. "Take care of yourself," he said before walking away, and I knew I'd never see him again. In the weeks that followed, I started to rebuild. Slowly, tentatively, I applied for jobs, sent out resumes, and tried to put the pieces of my life back together. The weight of what I'd done, of everything I'd lost, never left me, but I learned to carry it. I learned to face the whispers, the judgment, the awkward silences from people who knew too much. Chris filed for divorce shortly after I moved out. The process was quick and brutal, like ripping off a bandage. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to negotiate. He just wanted me out of his life, and I couldn't blame him. I signed the papers without a fight, knowing I had no right to ask for anything more. One night, as I sat alone in my tiny new apartment, I found myself scrolling through old photos of Chris and me. Back when we were happy, back when things were simpler. I wondered if I could have done something differently, if there was a moment where I could have turned back and saved us. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that we'd been broken long before Eric came into the picture. My mistakes may have been the final blow, but they weren't the only ones to blame. Time moved forward, as it always does. I found a new job at a smaller company where no one knew my name or my story. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a fresh start, a chance to prove to myself that I could move on. I cut ties with everyone from my old life, including Eric. It was painful at first, but eventually it became a relief, like shedding an old skin that no longer fit. The hardest part was forgiving myself. There were nights when the guilt would hit me like a wave, crashing over me and pulling me under. But slowly, I learned to breathe through it, to remind myself that I wasn't defined by my worst mistakes. I wasn't proud of what I'd done, but I was determined not to let it ruin the rest of my life. Every now and then, I'd catch myself thinking about Chris. I'd wonder if he was happier without me, if he'd found someone new, someone who could give him the things I couldn't. Part of me hoped he had. He deserved it, even if I didn't. As for me, I'm still figuring things out. My life isn't perfect, it's messy and complicated and full of scars, but it's mine, and for the first time in years, I feel like I'm living it for myself.